At the most famous racetrack on Earth, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, there is a record that has stood for more than 3 decades and may never fall. 6 pole positions. 6 times. One man qualified faster than every other driver on the planet for the greatest race in the world. His name was Rick Mears, and nobody in the history of the Indianapolis 500 has ever been quicker when it mattered most. Now, stack the rest of it on top. He won the Indianapolis 500 4 times, joining the most exclusive club in motorsport. In 15 starts at the Speedway, he qualified on the front row 11 times. 11 out of 15. Think about that. For nearly the entire span of his career, when the gun went off, Rick Mears was almost always sitting in the first 3 positions, ready to pounce. He won 3 national championships. He won the Indianapolis 500 in only his 2nd start. He set a closed-course speed record of 233.934 miles per hour. And here is what makes him so different from the legend many of you just met. AJ. Foyt went to war. Foyt was fire and fury, the man who scolded rivals and made enemies and treated every race like a brawl. Rick Mears was the exact opposite. He was soft-spoken, almost shy, a quiet and humble gentleman who rarely raised his voice and almost never made an enemy. He let the car do the talking, and the car spoke in records. He spent his entire career with one team, Roger Penske's, one of the most perfect partnerships sports has ever produced. He survived a crash so brutal it nearly cost him both feet, and then came back and won 2 more Indianapolis 500s on the wreckage of his legs without once complaining about it. He retired at the peak of his powers on his own terms, quietly, the way he did everything. So how good was Rick Mears actually? And is the quietest man in the paddock secretly the greatest Indianapolis driver who ever lived? He was born Richard Ravon Mears on the 3rd of December, 1951 in Wichita, Kansas, but he grew up in Bakersfield, California, the same dusty Central Valley town that would later produce a NASCAR champion named Kevin Harvick, and his path into racing began nowhere near a paved oval. It began in the desert. The Mears family raced off-road, not midgets on dirt ovals, not sprint cars, but the wild, punishing world of desert and Baja racing, where you point a vehicle across open terrain and survive hundreds of miles of rocks, dust, and chaos. His father Bill raced, his brother Roger raced, and young Rick raced alongside them, learning car control not on a smooth circuit, but on the brutal, unpredictable floor of the desert, where the surface is never the same twice, and a mistake means a rollover in the middle of nowhere. This was the strangest possible foundation for a future king of Indianapolis, and that is exactly what makes it remarkable. The traditional path to IndyCar stardom ran through midgets and sprint cars on dirt ovals, the route that forged men like Foyt. Rick Mears did not come from that world at all. He came from the buggies and trucks of off-road racing, a discipline that taught him patience, mechanical sympathy, and an almost preternatural feel for a vehicle at the edge of grip. In 1976, he even won the legendary Pikes Peak Hill climb, charging a car up a mountain. There was nothing about this quiet young man from Bakersfield that screamed future legend. He was not loud. He was not a self-promoter. He was not a famous name from a famous racing nursery. He was a soft-spoken desert racer with an unusual background and a gift that had not yet found its proper stage. Most observers of American racing in the mid-1970s had never heard of him, and those who had filed him away as an off-road specialist, a category that almost never produced champions on the great paved ovals. The dramatic question of Rick Mears's career is a quiet one, just like the man. How does a humble kid racing buggies in the desert become the most precise, most dominant qualifier the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has ever seen? The answer is that the very things the desert taught him, control, smoothness, and a refusal to overdrive the car, turned out to be the exact ingredients that Indianapolis rewards above all others. Rick Mears made the leap to IndyCar racing in the mid-1970s, and the early going was humble in the extreme. He did not arrive with a top ride or a powerful team. He scraped into the sport from the bottom, making his championship debut in 1976 with a modest effort, and then, in 1977, driving for the tiny Art Sugai team in an obsolete, outdated Eagle Offenhauser, a car that had no business contending for anything. The results were what you would expect from a nobody in old equipment. He struggled, and in a humbling low point that he would later look back on with a wry smile, Rick Mears failed even to qualify for the Indianapolis 500 in 1977. The future six-time pole winner, the man who would one day own the qualifying record at the Brickyard, could not make the field. If you had told anyone at the Speedway that day that this quiet kid in the obsolete car would become the greatest qualifier in the history of the race, they would have laughed. But here is the thing about raw speed. It cannot be hidden, even in a bad car. The people who knew what they were looking at noticed something. Even in inferior machinery, Rick Mears was fast, and not just fast, but smooth, controlled, and easy on his equipment in a way that suggested a much higher ceiling. The kid did not abuse the car. He found speed without drama, without theatrics, the way a master craftsman makes a hard thing look effortless. And one man in particular was watching. Roger Penske, the most meticulous, most successful team owner in American racing, a man obsessed with precision and professionalism, saw in this unassuming desert racer exactly the qualities he prized most. Penske already had stars like Mario Andretti and Tom Snever, but Andretti was splitting his time with Formula One in Europe, and Penske wanted a young, hungry driver who would focus completely on American racing, who would fit his disciplined, detail-obsessed operation. He saw a quiet kid with blinding speed and no ego, and he made his move. The knock on Mears was real. He was an off-road guy with no open-wheel pedigree, a driver who had just failed to qualify for the biggest race in the world. But Roger Penske did not care about pedigree. He cared about talent and temperament, and Rick Mears had both. In the fall of 1977, Penske signed him. It was the beginning of one of the greatest partnerships the sport would ever know, and the moment a quiet legend was finally handed the machinery to match his gift. The impact was immediate, and it was stunning. Roger Penske initially signed Mears as a part-time driver, a substitute to fill the races where Mario Andretti's Formula One schedule pulled him to Europe. So Rick Mears entered the 1978 season not as a full-fledged star, but as a fill-in, a young understudy expected to keep the seat warm. He did considerably more than that. In his very first Indianapolis 500 in 1978, the off-road kid who had failed to qualify the year before put Penske's car on the front row. The front row. In his debut. He did not just make the field. He started among the fastest three cars in the world. He was named Co-Rookie of the Year. And he won his first IndyCar race that season at Milwaukee. The substitute was outshining the stars. You can imagine the reaction inside the Penske camp. They had brought in a quiet young man to plug a gap in the schedule, and instead they had discovered a phenomenon, a driver whose feel for a fast car and whose calm under pressure were already, in his rookie season, world-class. The chemistry between Mears and the Penske organization was instant and total. Penske built immaculate, perfectly prepared machines, and Mears drove them with a precision and a mechanical sympathy that made them last. It was a marriage made in racing heaven, and it would never end. Rick Mears would drive for Roger Penske and only Roger Penske for his entire career. But arriving as a sensation and becoming a champion are two different things. And the wall in front of Mears was the same wall that faced every young driver of his era, the Giants. This was the age of A.J. Foyt at his most fearsome, of Mario Andretti and the Unser brothers, the deepest and most talented generation American open-wheel racing has ever produced. For a part-time substitute, however gifted, to break through and beat these legends was a tall order. He was still seen, in some quarters, as the kid filling in for Andretti, talented but unproven, a promising newcomer who had not yet won anything that truly mattered. Rick Mears, in his quiet way, was about to change that perception faster than anyone imagined. Because in his very next season, on the biggest stage in the sport, the understudy was going to announce himself as the main act. In 1979, in only his second start at the Indianapolis 500, Rick Mears won the race, and he did it the way that would become his signature. By qualifying on the pole, fastest of everyone, and then driving a clean, controlled, masterful 500 miles to the checkered flag, beating the great A.J. Foyt himself in the process. The quiet kid from the desert was a champion of the Indianapolis 500, and he did not stop there. That same year, he won the national championship, his first. The substitute had become, in the space of a single season, the best driver in American racing. What followed was a stretch of dominance that revealed the full depth of his evolution. Mears won back-to-back national championships in 1981 and 1982, becoming the first driver ever to capture 3 of the sport's premier titles, and he proved he was far more than an oval specialist. In 1981, Rick Mears did something no IndyCar driver had ever done. He won every single road course race on the schedule in one season, setting a race record in each victory at Watkins Glen, Mexico City, and Riverside. The desert racer who was supposed to only know ovals was beating the road course experts at their own game. But the evolution of a master is not only measured in victories, it is measured in how he handles heartbreak, and Mears had his. The 1982 Indianapolis 500 came down to a furious final lap charge, Mears closing on the leader Gordon Johncock, reeling him in foot by foot down the final straightaway. He ran out of racetrack. He lost by 16/100ths of a second, the closest finish in the history of the race at that time. So close he could have reached out and touched the win, and it slipped away. A lesser man might have been broken by a defeat that narrow on that bigger stage. Rick Mears simply absorbed it, filed it away, and went back to work, because the quiet ones do not rage, they recalibrate. By the early 1980s, he had become something the sport had rarely seen. A driver who combined blistering one-lap qualifying speed with the patience and mechanical care to nurse a car 500 grueling miles to the finish. His philosophy was simple and devastating. Take it easy when it does not matter, and run hotter than anybody else when it counts. He saved everything, the car and himself, for the moments that decided races. And when those moments came, nobody was faster. The partnership with Penske had matured into a machine of relentless precision, and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the place that had once rejected him, was about to become the stage for the greatest dominance of his life. The dynasty of Rick Mears is written into the bricks at Indianapolis. 4 victories and a qualifying record that defines what mastery of a single racetrack truly means. To understand his peak, you have to understand that no one has ever bent the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to his will quite like the quiet man from Bakersfield. It began with that 1979 triumph, the pole-winning drive in only his second start, beating Foyt, announcing a king. But the second win in 1984 showed a different kind of dominance. Total, suffocating control. The contenders that day, Tom Snever and the great Mario Andretti, dropped out in the second half of the race, and Rick Mears was simply gone, cruising at the front a full 2 laps ahead of the entire field, so far in front that the race was effectively over. He set a new speed record for the 500 miles. It was the kind of victory that looks easy and is anything but a masterclass in being fast enough to lead and smart enough to make the car survive. And then came the darkness that would have ended most careers, the crash that nearly took his feet. The story we will tell in full in a moment, because what makes the 3rd and 4th Indianapolis victories so staggering is that Rick Mears won them on rebuilt, damaged legs after an injury that nearly forced him out of the sport forever. In 1988, several years after that horrific crash, Mears returned to the speedway, put the Penske on the pole once again, fastest of everyone, and drove to his third Indianapolis 500 victory. The man whose feet had been shattered was, somehow, still the fastest qualifier and the most complete racer at the most demanding track in the world. But the masterpiece, the race Rick Mears himself considered the finest of his career, came in 1991. By then he was a veteran later in his career, and he knew his time was running short. So he ran the entire race with a single plan: conserve everything, stay in contention, and be ready for the shootout at the very end. And for the only time in his 4 Indianapolis victories, that shootout actually materialized against a young, ferocious Michael Andretti, son of Mario, one of the fastest drivers of the new generation. Watch the duel unfold, because it is one of the greatest finishes the Speedway has ever seen. Late in the race, after a restart, Michael Andretti does something almost no one dares to try at Indianapolis. He passes Rick Mears around the outside going into the first turn, the high line, the dangerous line, and snatches the lead. It is a breathtaking, aggressive move from the young challenger, and for most leaders it would be the end of the argument. But Rick Mears is not most leaders. On the very next lap, the quiet master answers in the most emphatic way imaginable. He drives into that same first turn, and he goes around the outside of Michael Andretti, returning the exact move, the high line, the white knuckle line, reclaiming the lead with a pass so audacious and so perfect that it left the racing world breathless. And then, with the lead back in his hands, Mears reaches down, turns up the turbocharger boost, and simply drives away. His 4th Indianapolis 500, a win he earned not by leading flag to flag, but by saving everything for one perfect ice-cold, head-to-head battle, and then winning it with a move for the ages. 4 Indianapolis 500 victories, spread across 1979, 1984, 1988, and 1991. An astonishing 12-year span at the very top of the most competitive race in the world. And surrounding those wins, the qualifying record that may stand forever. 6 pole positions at Indianapolis, more than any human being who has ever attempted the race, and a front-row start in 11 of his 15 appearances. Across the years, the villains came and went: Foyt and Mario Andretti, and the Unzers, Danny Sullivan and Emerson Fittipaldi, and finally young Michael Andretti, the best drivers of 3 different generations. And at the one place that matters more than any other in American racing, the quiet man beat them all, more often and more decisively than anyone before or since. He did not intimidate, he did not bluster. He just qualified faster than everyone and then found a way to win, again and again and again, until the Indianapolis Motor Speedway felt less like a racetrack and more like Rick Mears' living room. Slow down here, because the quietest legend in racing carried a pain that he almost never spoke about, and it nearly ended everything. In August of 1984, just months after dominating the Indianapolis 500, Rick Mears was practicing at a track called Saint-Air in Quebec when he crashed. The Indy cars of that era were death traps for the lower body, the driver seated far forward in the nose of the car, with almost nothing between his feet and the front of the chassis. When Mears hit, the impact destroyed his legs and feet. The injuries were catastrophic, the kind that, in a slightly different era, would have meant amputation. Surgeons performed extensive reconstructive work just to save his feet. Think about what that means for a race car driver, an athlete whose entire craft depends on the delicate, precise control of pedals with his feet. Rick Mears' feet, his instruments, the most important tools of his trade, were shattered and rebuilt. He missed the rest of that season. He could only race a partial schedule the following year. He would live with the consequences, the limitations and the chronic pain for the rest of his career and beyond. And here is where the true character of the man reveals itself. In the most quietly heroic way imaginable, Rick Mears did not make his suffering a story. He did not seek sympathy. He did not complain. He simply did the work of healing, got back in the car, adapted his driving to his damaged feet, and then went out and won 2 more Indianapolis 500s. 2. On feet that had been crushed and reconstructed. He won the most physically and mentally demanding race in the world, twice, after an injury that should have ended his career, and he did it with the same calm, understated grace he brought to everything. There was no self-pity in Rick Mears, only a quiet, unbreakable resolve. There is one more piece of the human story, and it is about loyalty. In a sport where drivers chase money and chase rides from team to team, Rick Mears spent his entire career with one man, Roger Penske. From the moment Penske signed the unknown desert racer in 1977 to the day he retired, Mears never drove for anyone else. It was a bond built on mutual respect and shared excellence, the perfect driver for the perfect team, and it never wavered. In a world of mercenaries, the quiet master was faithful to the end. Rick Mears did the final act the way he did everything, quietly and on his own terms. There was no long, sad decline, no clinging to a fading talent. As 1980s closed, he was still operating at the highest level, named by the Associated Press as the driver of the decade for his dominance through those years. In 1989, he set a record 5th pole at Indianapolis. And though he lost that year's championship to his new teammate Emerson Fittipaldi in the final race, he won that finale and stood, at decade's end, as the most successful IndyCar driver of the entire 1980s. Then came the 1991 masterpiece, his 4th Indianapolis crown, and one of the greatest drives of his life, followed that August by his final career victory at Michigan. The 1992 Indianapolis 500 was harder. Mears broke a wrist in a practice crash and then, for the first time in his entire career, crashed out of the race itself. The man who had finished so many 500-mile battles with such precision was, for once, beaten by the speedway. He raced only a handful more times that season. And then, at the Penske team's Christmas party in December of 1992, Rick Mears stood up and quietly announced that he was done. He was 41 years old. He was still capable of winning, still respected as one of the very best in the world, still fully able to put a car on the front row at Indianapolis. He did not have to stop, but he chose to, on his own schedule, with no drama and no farewell tour, walking away from the cockpit while he was still a master. It stunned the racing world, this sudden, gentle exit from a man at the top of his craft. But it was perfectly Rick Mears. He left the way he raced, without fuss, without ego, exactly when he decided it was time. He never really left Team Penske, though. He simply changed roles, staying on for decades as a trusted advisor, consultant, and driver coach, the calm, wise voice in the ear of a new generation of Penske champions, passing along the quiet mastery he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Step back and look at the whole arc, and Rick Mears becomes a portrait of a very particular kind of greatness, the kind that does not shout. A quiet kid races buggies across the California desert with his father and brother, learning control on terrain that punishes every mistake. He scrapes into IndyCar racing at the bottom, in obsolete equipment, fails even to make the field at Indianapolis, and is nearly written off as an off-road specialist with no future on the great ovals. And then the most demanding team owner in the sport sees something in his calm, smooth, blistering speed, and everything changes. He wins the Indianapolis 500 in his second start, wins 3 national championships, and becomes the greatest qualifier the Brickyard has ever known. He has his feet destroyed in a horrific crash, says almost nothing about it, and comes back to win the greatest race in the world 2 more times on rebuilt legs. And then, still at his peak, he walks away quietly, faithful to one team for his entire career, and spends the rest of his life teaching others how to do what he did. What Rick Mears gave the sport was proof that you do not have to be loud to be legendary. In an era defined by the fire of A.J. Foyt and the ferocity of the great rivalries, Mears was the still center, The gentleman, the master, who let his driving speak and never needed to say a word himself. His 4 Indianapolis victories place him among the immortals, and his 6 poles set him apart from every driver who has ever attempted the race. He was respected by everyone, even the fiercest competitors, because he raced clean, won fair, and carried himself with a humility that the win total never dented. There have been more versatile champions. There have been louder ones. There has rarely been a more complete master of one specific sacred place. Which brings us to the question: is Rick Mears the greatest Indianapolis driver who ever lived? This is a debate where the quiet man has a genuinely powerful case. The competition is fearsome. AJ Foyt also won the Indianapolis 500 4 times, and did it across an even longer span while conquering every other form of racing on Earth, which gives Foyt the clear edge in overall versatility. Alonso won at Indianapolis 4 times as well, with a smooth brilliance all his own, and Mario Andretti, perhaps the most talented of them all, dominated Indy car racing for decades. Each of these men has a legitimate claim to greatness that no honest person would dismiss. But narrow the question to its sharpest point, to mastery of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway itself, and Rick Mears' case becomes extraordinary. Consider the qualifying record: 6 pole positions, more than Foyt, more than Unser, more than anyone in the history of the race, a mark that has stood for over 30 years. Consider the consistency: a front row start in 11 of his 15 attempts. A rate of sustained excellence at that one track that simply has no equal. Consider that he won 4 times in only 15 starts, an astonishing strike rate, and that he won 2 of those after an injury that nearly cost him his feet. And consider the cruel contrast with Mario Andretti, a man widely seen as more naturally gifted, who for all his brilliance won the Indianapolis 500 only once. At the Brickyard specifically, the place that humbles the greatest drivers in the world, nobody combined raw qualifying speed, race day patience, and sheer winning consistency the way Rick Mears did. So here is the fair verdict. Foyt and Andretti were more versatile across the whole landscape of motorsport, and that matters. But if the question is who mastered the Indianapolis Motor Speedway most completely, who was the best pure Indianapolis driver who ever lived, the quiet man from Bakersfield has a claim as strong as anyone's, and the qualifying record to prove it. It is very hard to argue against the greatest qualifier in the history of the greatest in the world, who also happened to win it 4 times, half of them on broken feet, without ever once raising his voice. The soft-spoken desert racer who failed to make the field, became the master of the Brickyard, the greatest qualifier the Indianapolis 500 has ever known, a 4-time champion who won on shattered feet, and walked away with grace, while still at the top. Not the most versatile of all time, but perhaps the purest Indianapolis driver who ever lived, and living proof that the quietest man in the room can be the most dangerous. If you want to meet the family that turned Indianapolis into a dynasty, the brothers and the son who won the 500 again and again across 3 generations, watch our deep dive on the Unsers, the first family of the Brickyard, because the golden age of Indianapolis was full of quiet masters and loud legends, and every one of them has a story worth telling.